My name is Terry McDonald. I'm Dean of the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts here at the university, and I'm here today to introduce today's lecturer, Arvind-Pal Singh Mandair, Latara Singh and Balwant Kaur Chadha, and Gurbukh Singh and Kapil Pal Kaur, Sikh Studies Professor. At the end of the lecture, we'll have a few minutes for questions, and following that, you're all invited to a reception in the assembly hall, which is through the double doors right there at the end of the seats. To begin, I'd like to say a few words about this professorship and the generous community of donors who made it possible. This professorship was made possible by a very generous group of donors in the Sikh Studies Association, who worked together to create this position in Sikh Studies in the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures. These donors raised the endowment with remarkable dedication and diligence over many, many years to make possible the professorship we are celebrating today. In building the fund, the Sikh community was motivated by the great value it has always placed on higher education and the pride it shares that the study of Sikhism has exceeded the boundaries of India and been extended to the Western world. These dedicated individuals wanted to ensure that Sikh studies would be a viable part of the University of Michigan for generations to come, preserving this treasured cultural heritage for students and scholars, and ensuring that those interested in this important area of study would have access to courses focusing on Sikh culture in areas such as religion, history, literature, and the Punjabi language. The named professorship honors the parents of Dr. Amrik Singh Chadha and Dr. Jaswinder Kaur Chadha, who contributed a substantial portion of the total endowment for the chair. Both Amrik and Jaswinder Chadha are with us today. They are here to share in celebrating the fruition of a dream their family has supported so generously. I'm delighted they were able to make the trip from West Virginia to be here for this occasion. Would you please stand so that we can acknowledge you? Thank you so much. Also in attendance are numerous other donors and friends of Sikh Studies, including Verinder Grewal, Chain Singh Sandhu, and Mrs. Raman Kaur Singh. Would you please stand too? And I want to acknowledge a wonderful partner in these efforts here at the university, the long-serving chair of the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures, Don Lopez. Professor Lopez. Don came to the university in 1989, and I think shortly thereafter began working on making this day possible. So I want to acknowledge all the cooperation that Don has provided over the years. And I also just want to say personally, it's been my great pleasure to work on this and to have this day that means so much to all of us who've worked on it together for so many years. It's a real point of personal pride that we're celebrating this great moment in the history of this relationship with the Sikh community. Now let us turn to our honoree. Arvind Mandair was awarded his Bachelor of Science degree with first-class honors in chemistry in 1985 from the United Kingdom's Council of National Academic Awards, followed by a PhD in chemistry in 1989 from Aston University. After working for several multinational companies, he changed careers in the early 1990s and took up the study of philosophy, receiving a Master of Arts in Philosophy with distinction from the University of Warwick in 1994. This was followed by a second PhD, this time in philosophy and religion from the University of Warwick in 1999. From 1999 to 2001, he was a research fellow at the University of London before he joined the faculty of Hofstra University as the S.K.K. Bindra Endowed Chair in Sikh Studies. In 2006, Professor Mandair came to the University of Michigan. Professor Mandair's research is wide-ranging. His background is the study of Sikhism and the religions of South Asia, which he examines through the lenses of different disciplines, from philosophy, post-colonial studies, the colonial history of India, and the critical study of religion. He's a very productive author. His first book is entitled Religion in the Spectre of the West, Sikhism, India, Post-Coloniality, and the Politics of Translation, which was published in 2009 with Columbia University Press. He is co-author and co-translator of, quote, The Teachings of the Sikh Gurus, published in 2005. His edited volumes also include Secularism and Religion Making, published by Oxford University Press in 2011, and Sikh Culture and Religion and Ethnicity. In addition to this, he has published numerous journal articles and book chapters. He is currently working on 2 further monographs, Transformations of Mind, Encounters Between Sikh and Western Thought, and Mourning Sovereignties, Sikhism, Civil Society, and the State. Professor Mandair is also the founding editor of the journal Sikh Formations, Religion, Culture, and Theory, and serves as assistant editor of the journal Culture and Religion, both published by Routledge. And I should add that Sikh Formations is now considered to be the leading journal in the field of Sikh studies, and we're very proud to have that journal and its editor here at the university. In 2009, he was invited by the University of London School of Oriental and African Studies to deliver the Jordan Lectures in Comparative Religion. As an instructor, Professor Mandair routinely receives high praise for his teaching. He's known for his ability to attract a wide range of students to his courses due to his versatility and facility with a wide range of topics. Students find his courses to be rigorous and intellectually stimulating. He's been a dedicated faculty member in the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures, having served 3 terms on the Departmental Executive Committee and 3 terms on the Graduate Program Committee. He founded the Michigan Sikh Studies Forum here at the university, and he's been active with the Center for South Asian Studies in the International Institute. We at Michigan are lucky to have a scholar of Professor Mandair's reputation in our midst, as he is highly regarded by his peers. One reviewer has noted of his career that he's established himself as one of the leading scholars in Sikh studies in North America, writing, quote, "He has pioneered a new agenda for Sikh studies at the cutting edge of contemporary thinking and critical theory in a way that marks a decisive breach with the previous generation of scholars working in this field." Professor Mandair brings to this professorship a strong record of in-depth, interdisciplinary research, dedicated teaching, tremendous productivity, and a firm grasp on the future of Sikh studies. It gives me great pleasure to see a person of his standing serve as the inaugural occupant of the Tara Singh and Balwant Kaur Chadha and Gurbakh Singh and Kapal Bauer Chadha Sikh Studies Professorship, Arvind-Pal Singh Mandair.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted you could all be here today. My sincere thanks to Dean MacDonald for his generous introduction. I'm deeply honored to be able to deliver this lecture today. Before I begin, though, I want to thank a few people for making this event possible. First of all, my thanks and profound gratitude to the Sikh community, and of course to all the donors who made this event possible. As Dean MacDonald has already mentioned, this chair in Sikh Studies is the result of over 2 decades of hard work, of fundraising and the generosity of many people in the Sikh community, both within Michigan and outside of Michigan. On a different note, I want to thank my colleagues and the administrative staff in the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures for providing such a stimulating and productive environment in which to think and teach. And of course, my thanks to many other colleagues from around the university. In particular, I also want to thank Professor Don Lopez, the chair of ALC, and former chair Professor Nancy Florida, for their mentorship and support over the last few years. I'd also like to thank the LSA events management team, especially Anne Hart, and the development office, including Diane Tracy, for all the meticulous preparation that goes into events such as this one. Last but by no means least, I want to thank all the wonderful graduate and undergraduate students who have taken my classes and continue to push my thinking in different and novel ways. My lecture is composed of 3 different parts. I'll begin by talking about the development of modern Sikh studies, which I treat in terms of 3 phases, first, second, and third phase. The second part will ask questions about the framing of Sikh studies, which I connect to broader historical and political issues. The basic argument that I'm putting across is that Sikh studies has yet to properly interrogate the architecture of the field, and one of the main components of this architecture is the religion-secular binary, to which I make reference by way of the discipline of literature. Towards the end of the lecture, I try to think about a possible third phase of Sikh studies and what that might entail. The emergence of Sikh studies as a distinct field within the humanities and social sciences can be traced to the confluence of several streams of activity that impacted the academy during the 1960s. One stream was the development of area studies, which coincided with the US interests in the Cold War era and became the central paradigm for organizing the study of non-Western cultures in the university system. The other stream was the growth of religious studies as a secular discipline during the 1960s. Though rarely conceded, there were intimate connections, but also tensions between the expansion of area studies programs, the flowering of post-1960s counterculture, and the simultaneous secularization of the study of religion. It is this very tension that characterized the first phase of Sikh studies in the West, from the 1960s to the 1970s. During these decades, as the area studies programs grew, the subject of Sikh studies attracted a number of talented scholars. The first generation of scholars were attracted to the subject by the renewed interest in Sikhs and Sikhism, occasioned by the campaign for a linguistically separate Punjabi-speaking province in post-independence India, but no less by events such as the 500th birth anniversary celebrations of the founder of Sikhism, Guru Nanak, in 1969, or the growing migration of Sikhs to the UK, Canada, and the USA during these years. The first phase of research was underpinned by concerns as seemingly different as the politics of developing areas and the problem of national integration in countries like India, or the desire in divinity schools for an intellectual orientation that could respect cultural and religious differences. Seminal publications from this early period include Paul Brass's Language, Religion and Politics in North India, or W.H. MacLeod's seminal work, Guru Nanak and the Sikh Religion, a work that turned out to be as controversial as it was influential. Equally important, but of a decidedly different note, was Christopher Shackle's Sacred Language of the Sikhs and his Guru Nanak Glossary, which provided the basic linguistic tools needed by Western students of Sikhism, or the Sikhs of the diaspora who had lost touch with Punjabi, for approaching the scriptures in the original. From the late 1970s onwards, with a growing critical mass of publications in Sikh studies, efforts were underway to consolidate and demarcate the boundaries of the emerging field. One of the main channels for this process was a spate of academic conferences at campuses such as Berkeley, Toronto, Columbia, and London, and the setting up of scholarly research groups based in North America and in the UK. Now, conference activities are not the best indicators of the growth of any particular field, but nevertheless, some of the proceedings resulting from these events left an invaluable record for assessing how the next generation of scholars were attracted to the field, how they reacted to important events affecting Sikh studies during the troubled decades of the 1980s and 90s, how the Sikh community responded to the work of these scholars, and ultimately how the field itself evolved as a result of this mutual interaction. Now, the second phase of Sikh studies in the West was nothing if not ironic in its development, for the intellectual growth of the field was matched by an equally impressive expansion of funding resources from the community. However, this fortuitous growth of funding and new scholars was unfortunately overshadowed by the ongoing political crisis in the Punjab during the 1980s, when Sikh politics often came into conflict with the Indian state, culminating in the notorious Operation Blue Star, where the Indian Army, in their attempt to dislodge militant Sikhs, destroyed parts of the Golden Temple complex and torched invaluable historical archives and manuscripts. This was a time when communal tensions were heightened as never before, and a period of traumatic polarization for Sikh diaspora communities, as Western governments, especially in Canada and the UK, first began to be concerned about Sikh politics, if only from a security standpoint. Now, the response to this crisis by some Sikh community leaders and intellectuals in North America and the UK was to turn towards the university as a forum which they believed would help raise awareness in the West about Sikhism and also help balance the negative media imagery of Sikhs at the time. So again, collectively, there was a flurry of academic conferences at various universities throughout North America and the UK, the most important of which was the University of Toronto Conference in 1987, followed immediately by meetings at Berkeley, Michigan, and the University of Warwick in the UK. The success and optimism generated by these initial conferences then led to more concerted efforts to raise funds for permanent programs, culminating in the establishment of the first chair of Sikh Studies at the University of British Columbia, and a program of Sikh Studies courses at the University of Toronto in 1988. The Toronto program closed within 2 years due to sustained opposition from certain sections of the community, but the Sikh American community did not lag far behind their Canadian counterparts. Spurred on partly by the Punjab crisis and partly by issues of identity and heritage transmission, efforts were underway in the 1980s the late 1980s to raise money for programs for Sikh and Punjabi language studies. By the early 1990s, enough money had been collected to start programs at the University of Michigan and at Columbia. However, while the Columbia program eventually folded, the Michigan program, although it had its fair share of ups and downs at the beginning, eventually culminated in the establishment of a chair in Sikh studies. The period spanning the 1980s and early 90s was also a time of crisis and bewilderment for scholars in Sikh studies. For despite the fact that emerging scholars of this period were breaking new ground by questioning received canons of scripture and history, or by opening up Sikh studies to new avenues of inquiries such as feminism or women's studies, or political ethnography, many scholars in this second phase also found themselves trapped between the competing rhetorics of Sikh ethno-nationalism and anti-Sikh sentiments generated by the Indian media and government at the time. As the late Professor Jerry Barrier has written, just as American politics, metaphor, and public discourse were altered by the attacks on September the 11th, 2001, so the growing militancy and turmoil of this period reshaped the relationship between religion and politics among Sikhs. Academic research and authors quickly became enmeshed in the ensuing debates over controversial aspects in Sikh public life. Debates turned into polemics, and polemics turned into wars of scholarship, a term that referred to much more than just heated polemics and controversies. By the late 1990s, and certainly by the year 2000, as the political landscape of Punjab and the Sikh diaspora returned to some kind of normalcy, there was a renewed optimism about the future of Sikh studies, and universities once again began attracting major funding from Sikh donors, although this time it was donated primarily by individual donors. As a result, by 2010, there were 4 more chairs established on the West Coast in the University of California system, and 2 more on the East Coast, with the strong possibility of a Center for Sikh Studies being established at Hofstra University next year. The creation of new chairs also provided an opportunity for scholars in Sikh studies to analyze what had happened in the first 2 phases and to make projections for the future orientations of Sikh studies. Indeed, there were many attempts to reflect on the state of the field, some of them taking the form of book-length publications, such as J.S. Ghariwal's Contesting Interpretations of the Sikh Traditions, a number of conference volumes, or simply journal articles, such as Hugh MacLeod's Cries of Outrage. This piece was published in the journal South Asia Research. What's interesting to note is not simply the degree of convergence in scholarly opinion about what went wrong with the second phase, but more importantly, the operative assumptions that many leading scholars of Sikh studies continue to make about the nature of Sikhs and Sikhism, about the critical nature of the scholarly enterprise called Sikh studies, and about the location of the field of Sikh studies within the rarefied public space of the humanities and social sciences. Some of the key operative assumptions can be summarized as follows. First, in order to be able to claim legitimacy in the modern academy, Sikh studies had to be grounded in critical discourse, where the term critical and entitlement to something like a critical Sikh studies is premised on a break with or a distancing from the traditionalist standpoint of normative Sikh theology. Secondly, that scholars who work in critical Sikh studies have, by definition, transcended the legacies of colonialism because they have adopted a secular framework of understanding, which by default is distanced from the object of study. And note the circularity here between critique and secularity, which I'll try and make reference to later on. Thirdly, and here is the irony, despite the critical break, scholars continue to attribute theological essence to the object of their study, Sikhism. Indeed, this putative ascription of theological essence was, as we shall see, crucial to their ability to construct Sikhism in a particular way. although they also had an escape clause by saying, well, we don't actually do theology, but we've broken with it, etc., etc. And this is part of a discourse for analyzing religious studies that has actually been around for 15 years or so now. Now, the question that arises is this. In order to establish Sikh studies as a properly critical discourse, how was it possible for scholars to argue for a break with normative Sikh theology, but at the same time invest heavily in perpetuating the idea that the object of their study, Sikhism, is a religion with a natural theology, that the Sikh way of life, or what it means to be a Sikh or Sikhi, is synonymous with religion, without giving it a second thought? Why would an ostensibly secular field, in the very process of defining itself as secular, rely on a putative ascription of theology or religion to its object? One might be tempted to ignore this as a methodological quirk, were it not for the fact that this move is embedded into the discursive fabric of virtually all disciplines that comprise modern critical Sikh studies, whether it be literature, politics, sociology, anthropology, history, and in recent years, the discipline of musicology. In what follows, I'd like to take a closer look at one of the framing statements of the modern discipline of Sikh and Punjab studies, and specifically the modern discipline of Punjabi literature. Punjabi literature is interesting partly because its production has often mirrored political upheavals in the Punjab, and these upheavals are in turn generated by two strands of identity construction for Sikhs in the modern era, which for the sake of argument I shall simply call religion making and secularization. Now, conventional wisdom tells us that these two strands, religion making and secularization, are opposed to each other, insofar as they refer to the putatively religious formation called modern Sikhism on the one hand, and the putatively secular formation called Punjabi culture on the other. Closer examination, however, shows that they are far from being opposed to each other. Indeed, in social politics and in literary imagination, these two seemingly opposed formations turn out to be dialectically related to each other. And this dialectical relationship, I will suggest, also reveals the major fault lines or sites of tension that run through almost all other disciplines that comprise modern Sikh studies and provide a useful way of analyzing the so-called wars of scholarship in the second phase of modern Sikh studies. Let me start by contextualizing the terms religion-making and secularization in relation to Sikh studies. By religion-making, I refer to a dual process where Sikh reformist elites in the 19th century, in dialogue with Indologists and missionaries, constructed a normative Sikh theology which allowed them to concretize Sikh identity as essentially religious. They did this by equating the teachings of the Sikh gurus, or Gurmat, with the idiom of theology, and which henceforth became an authentic mode of representation for Sikh experience, for its beliefs and practices. In addition, they identified Punjabi, the language, as their mother tongue and as a sacred language, and then presaging this mother tongue into the service of theological commentaries, thereby generating the idea that Sikhism is a modern world religion. Since the 1920s, this normative status, initially given by the Singh Sabha scholars, these Sikh reformists of the 19th and early 20th century, was further endorsed and underwritten by Sikh organizations that succeeded the earlier Singh Sabha, politically by the Akali Dal or the SGPC, which is the Sikh Nationalist Party, an organizational body, and pedagogically by university scholars and teachers appointed by the Akali Dal SGPC in the universities of Punjab. That was the term religion making. Let me just say a little bit about the way I use secularization here. The articulation of Sikhism as a religion did not go uncontested, this early reform period. By the turn of the century, and most definitely by the 1920s, there were a number of dissident voices, scholars and activists who challenged this theologization of Sikh culture and identity, led by literary figures such as Puran Singh, Mohan Singh Diwana, and many others that I could mention. However, these dissident voices found no coherent platform through which to voice their opinions until the emergence of the Ghadar movement. Now, the word Ghadar literally means anarchy, was the name of a newspaper published by the Hindustani Association of the Pacific Coast, a movement started in Canada in 1912. It drew 95% of its support from Sikhs who had migrated to Canada in the first decade of the 20th century. The Ghadar newspaper was strongly anti-imperialist in tone and inspired the rise of a revolutionary political movement in India which took the same name, Ghadar. The Ghadar movement itself failed at the political level, but many of its ideologues went on to form the Punjabi Marxist or communist movements of the 1930s. What's interesting to note about the Punjabi Marxists is, firstly, that their membership was composed primarily of Sikhs who had become disaffected with the reformist ideology of the Singh Sabha, the Chief Khalsa Diwan, Akali Dal, which they regarded as not sufficiently anti-British. Secondly, these dissident voices also identified Punjabi as their mother tongue, but this time presaged it into the service of a broader-based cultural identity, Punjabiyat. By effectively capturing the domain of literature, poetry, fiction, and cultural criticism, these Punjabi or Sikh Marxists created their own sphere of political and intellectual influence in the Punjab, propagating the loosely secular idea of Punjabiyat, which in the pre- and post-independence era provided the impetus for Punjabi linguistic nationalism in contrast to Sikh religious nationalism. Despite being able to trace a common heritage back to Punjabi poetry of the medieval period, since the 1930s, protagonists of both of these two social formations, Sikhism, modern Sikhism on the one hand versus Punjabiyat on the other, have occupied distinctly different political spaces, exemplified by the religious politics of the Akali Dal and the secular politics of Punjabi communists, respectively, but each claiming with equal passion that it is the sole guardian of Sikh and Punjabi language and literature. What interests me as far as this talk goes is not the religionist sphere, which I've looked at extensively elsewhere, but firstly, the mechanism by which the secular strand of Punjabi culture defines itself in contradistinction from the religious movement, and thereby effects a critical break or distancing from the religionist sphere. Secondly, how and why the mechanism of this break is fundamentally reliant on that which it seeks to break from, which is normative Sikh theology. And thirdly, how and why this bifurcation of Sikh religion and Punjabi culture as it plays out in the South Asian context also informs the framework of modern Sikh studies. In the works of Punjabi Marxists, possibly the most articulate and nuanced example of this secular narrative can be found in Uthar Singh's important work, The Secularization of Modern Punjabi Poetry. The thrust of this book is to explain the historical difference between medieval Punjabi on the one hand and modern Punjabi poetry on the other. So what he's doing is looking at poetic consciousness, as he calls it, in the medieval period, contrasting it with poetic consciousness in the modern period. And poetic consciousness is essentially language. It means the same as language. So let's look briefly at one or two of his main arguments. At the beginning of his book, Uthar Singh argues that religion has always existed in South Asia, whereas secularism did not exist prior to the encounter with Western modernity. So the idea of the secular is not indigenous to India, but rather an importation. The secularization of Indian culture begins, according to the argument, with the Indian Renaissance, especially through the birth of modern literature, which shifted the Indian mindset away from the theocentric impulses of medieval Punjabi poetry towards the humanist notions of autonomy. The secularization of medieval Punjabi poetry takes place through the usual processes of desacralization, the historicization of human existence, and the relativization of meaning. And we're still within his argument here. As Uthar Singh sees it, within medieval Punjabi poetry, religion is the central and progenitive element. Its function is to maintain boundaries, to keep the world of ordinary human experience subordinated. And even when religion makes reference to this world, it's presented not in human terms, but in ahistorical, transcendental terms. By contrast, Athar Singh argues this transcendentalizing tendency is absent, according to his argument, in properly secular poetry, which for him is represented by the 18th century Qissa tradition. For example, Varis Shah's Heer Ranja or Pilu's Mirza Sahiban. In other words, he presents the distinction between religion and the secular as if it were part of the natural order of things. But in later chapters, we get a better insight into how he theoretically frames religion and its relationship to poetic consciousness, which is language. And there's a couple of statements from his book. Only with an understanding of religion as the point of departure can we make a meaningful study of the secular principle in transforming the aesthetic consciousness of modern Punjabi poetry. Another statement. Poetic consciousness, the poetic consciousness of the medieval mystics was derived from the fervor of their faith. And a last one, central to the ideological structure of medieval Punjabi poetry is the idea of a personal God. So according to Athar Singh, the secularization of Punjabi language, its movement beyond the religious sensibilities of medieval poetry, happened in 3 successive stages. The first stage, according to him, is through the poetry and the novels of the great Sikh reformist Bhai Singh, who was actually the most influential of all of the 19th and early 20th century reformists. Bhai Singh effectively created an abstract intellectual concept of God in his work. And as a result of this abstract intellectual concept of God, he also laid the basis for modern Sikh self-consciousness, a consciousness that is able to separate itself from itself and thereby create a subject versus object framework, which becomes the basis for modern reformist or normative Sikh theology. The second stage is provided by writers such as Puran Singh, Mohan Singh, Dhaniram Chatrak, and Kirpa Sagar, and many others who attempted to break out from the narrow frame of reformist Sikh theology, and particularly as a reaction to Bhai Singh's work, towards an aesthetic humanism that allowed a spontaneous experience of nature. To do so, they increasingly invoked the idea of Punjabi culture in contradistinction from Sikh religion. And the third stage, after the 1930s, this cultural humanist expression evolved into the literary expressions of secular Indian nationalism, and it merged with Indian nationalism, which was a more overtly political humanism that found a diasporic or Pardesi expression in the literature of the Gadar activists and a nativist or Desi expression in the writings of the Punjabi Kisan movement. What needs to be asked, however, is whether these movements were really secular. If so, why do they all continue to draw profusely from the ostensibly religious or theocentric sources of medieval Punjabi poetry, such as the Ard Granth? More importantly, should these sources, especially the Ard Granth, which is the central Sikh scripture, even be regarded as transcendental or theological in nature? Clearly, the problem with Athar Singh's narrative is anachronism, the problem of applying modern conceptual frameworks, for example, the religion-secular binary, to virtually any culture at any time in history, and particularly to non-Western cultures. As I've argued elsewhere, we see this going on in the framing of other disciplines in modern Western Sikh studies, particularly the discipline of history. But what would happen if we stopped believing in this imaginary construct called Sikh theology? What implications might it have for Sikh studies in a secular university? It's here that I see important convergence, or actually I should say important convergences, between the future of Sikh studies and current research into religion and the secular, although I can't address this directly or in any detail here. Take, for example, the now fairly well-established idea that the modern definition of religion as a universal inward impulse or feeling towards some divine origin that's common to all humanity, this modern definition of religion is a relatively recent invention, constructed by scholars and policymakers during the 16th, between the 16th and the 20th century. The new definition of religion was a direct product of state building. necessary for the rise of the modern state, for modern nationalism and international society. Of course, the modern concept of secularity is simply the other side of the coin, being reinvented at exactly the same moment as the concept of religion. Insofar as the religion-secular binary presents itself as corresponding to nature, to the way things really are, rather than as a culturally constructed artifice, it should then be regarded as a fundamental doxa of modernity. And to quote Daniel Dubuisson, created by the West, enshrined in Western epistemology and central to its worldview. And we find this, precisely this doxa, at the heart of secular Punjabi literature. So while Atar Singh admits that the secular has not existed in South Asia prior to its encounter with modernity, he nevertheless expresses an ardent belief in the idea that religion has always been a part of the fabric of South Asian culture. The idea of the secular was there tacitly, but had not yet been brought fully into consciousness through a process of historical development and growth in rationality. In effect, Atar Singh needs to indulge in religion making so that he can establish the sense and the meaning of the secular and secularization. Like his Western counterparts in Sikh studies, Atar Singh deploys categories such as religion and the secular as if they were neutral terms pointing to an objective reality, whereas in fact they are little more than rhetorical constructions. As scholars such as Tomoko Masuzawa and Timothy Fitzgerald have argued in different ways, they are actually examples of the way in which modern Anglophone terminology is assumed to have universal validity, where Anglophone word-making becomes Anglophone world-making, and in doing so projects the appearance of a natural order of things, the way things are and the way things ought to be. Arguments such as these have made it easier to accept that the category of religion, far from always having existed in South Asian culture, was actually introduced into the South Asian context through the problematic processes of translation backed by the efficacy of a vast colonial machinery. What's less well understood, however, is the subjective process, how the modern concept of religion slowly but surely took shape within the psychic space of colonized native elites, thereby altering that space as colonized elites gained access to the Anglophone conceptual order in order to assert their rights and national identity. By the alteration of psychic space, I refer to the mechanism by which foreign concepts such as religion came to be regarded as if they had been indigenous categories all along. A helpful way of understanding this mechanism, which is often simplistically reduced to translation, is through the notion of interdiction. As I use it, the notion of interdiction is not only a theory about how native speech is altered and produced under conditions of power, it also provides insights about linguistic and conceptual encounter between South Asian and European contexts then and now. Interdiction can be visualized from an objective and subjective standpoint. Objectively, it refers to the law of the dominant conceptual order associated with the prestige of Anglophone categories that are mediated through the structure of the humanities and social sciences in this day and age that we're living in. From a subjective standpoint, or from the standpoint of native speakers subjected to its law, the interdict operates as a self-censorship that comes into effect by prohibiting an undesirable native speech and conceptuality, or undesirable meanings from being articulated. Though not always obvious, the mechanism of interdiction continues to operate within the humanities and social sciences despite its much vaunted democratic tendencies such as the toleration of cultural difference or its objectivity in representing non-Western cultures. Interdiction works at the level of the production of thought and therefore at the level of the production of speech, by censoring concepts that don't conform to the underlying logic of the Anglophone category, for example, the religion and secular that I'm working on here, forcing them to make sense by specifying access to uncensored identifications. And in the context of Sikh studies, as I've tried to show, the mechanism works by simultaneously producing, on the one hand, Sikh subjectivity as essentially religious and Sikh thought as essentially theological, and then quarantining them. And on the other hand, it produces its counterpart, which is the idea of Punjabiyat as an imagined secular culture. It's no wonder then that this idea of Punjabiyat, which signifies secular space and secular culture, flourished in the Cold War era, when area studies and religious studies converged in ways that are not often realized. However, what this convergence did was to produce a massive blind spot, namely its inability to recognize concepts and forms of speech and praxis that already resisted the religion-secular binary and attempted to present different ways of thinking. How then does one go about conceiving a new phase of Sikh studies which avoids some of these problems? How can Sikh studies recognize concepts and forms of speech or thought that fall beneath the radar of the modern social imaginary, to use Charles Taylor's phrase? How can one bring categories of Sikh thought to life that otherwise remain beneath the radar of the modern social imaginary? One possible way in which we can approach this task that would require no more than a subtle reorientation of our cognitive stance would be to operationalize indigenous Sikh categories as critical in their own right. This has much to do with the issue of translation, as I've already said, but it also goes well beyond translation conventionally understood. To operationalize Sikh categories means enabling them to circulate within, to compete with, and to distort corresponding Anglophone categories. For example, within the Sikh lexicon, there are numerous terms that harbor the potential to unsettle the dominance of Anglophone meanings by contesting and mutually distorting the conventionally understood meanings of religion, politics, secularism, and so on. Thus, when we study the translation of terms and concepts across cultures, the commonly used equivalents in local languages do not signal in the direction of synonymy of meaning, but in the direction of distortion. It's this ability to distort dominant conceptual frameworks that allows these indigenous terms to be seen as critical in a very real sense. Now, if all of this sounds like a purely academic exercise that can only be carried out by specialists, I'd like to caution against such an observation. Attempts to distort dominant frameworks of understanding to operationalize interdicted forms of life are already going on within the Sikh life world and are likely to intensify in the future. I don't have time to explore this in detail, so by way of conclusion, I'd like to point to a couple of quick examples. Take, for example, the field of politics, specifically in relation to Sikhs and the Indian state. Since the 1960s, political scientists have continued to frame Sikh politics within the mirror of the Indian nation-state discourse as a politics of religious identity, irrespective of whether the movements concerned were located within Punjab or in the diaspora. Because the state held the monopoly on how violence was used and interpreted in the public sphere, any resistance to the state version of events was framed as religious violence, which in India became synonymous with Sikhs even more so than with Muslims in the 1980s. However, indigenous Sikh discourses that resisted this framing went completely unnoticed. They were interdicted. A good example is, and the example that I'll use here, and there are many I could think of, is this figure, Professor Darshan Singh, also known as Darshan Singh Ragi, who in the late 1980s held the most authoritative position in Sikh society. He was the Akal Takht Jathedar, or the chairperson of the highest seat of Sikh sovereignty, the Akal Takht, for a period of almost 2 years. Now, Darshan Singh's speciality were his public discourses, which he presented through a traditional format of music and song, or kirtan, combined with an interpretive commentary on aspects of Sikh scripture, or katha. And he continues to do this on stages and in recorded media through cassettes, CDs, and now on the internet. What's evident, even from a cursory analysis of his work, is how effectively he deploys indigenous terms such as taramyud, pant, qaum, in such a way that they directly encounter and contest the prevailing rhetoric of public space by conceptually distorting its framework, by unraveling its framework, if you like, including, for example, the center-left rhetoric of the Indian state and political scientists, but just as importantly, the right-wing rhetoric of the Khalistan movement and the Hindutva movement. So all of this is going on within his discourses. It's a very interesting person, very interesting discourses that have just not been studied yet. Another example, and the last example, is that of Sikh musicology. During the period of colonial modernization, one of the key elements in the production of a unified modern Sikh identity was the standardization of the way in which Sikh teachings or Gurmat came to be experienced. In short, the experiential aspect of Gurmat was refashioned by driving a wedge between the literary and the musical aspects of the central Sikh text, the Guru Granth Sahib. From the time of its composition, the main body of the hymns in the Granth have been strictly organized under specific melodies and rhythms, or rags and tals, which could not be changed. During the late 19th century, however, there was a rationalization and eventual separation of the literary and musical aspects of the Guru Granth. This rationalization gave rise, on the one hand, to a systematic theology and belief system based around a new relationship to the text as primarily a literary and religious object to be understood through a proper grasp of grammar and a correct concept of the divine, effectively monotheism. And on the other hand, it recodified the Indian system of musical notation based on rag and tal according to Western staff notation. Music in general, but particularly Indian classical music, was implicitly associated with weaker, non-representable forms of consciousness that correspond to improper, that is, sensuous forms of the divine. So successful was this intellectual dichotomization that by the last decade of the 19th century, these modes, the various modes of experiencing Sikh scripture, Gurmat Sangeet and Vyakhya, came to be institutionalized under two different categories, the performative versus the theological, and eventually within different departments within the modern Punjabi universities, such that one could study text and meaning in a department of religion, history, and literature, but Gurmat Sangeet could only be studied in a department of music. The modernist emphasis on separating the musical and literary could hardly be more different from the pre-modern forms of experiencing Gurmat. I should say not just pre-modern, but the forms that are also in practice today, although they're beneath the radar, as I said. Surprisingly, though, this dichotomy is not only operative in public institutions, such as the modern university, both in Punjab and in the West, it has also become, at least implicitly, and particularly in regard to pedagogy, part of the experience and reception of the transmission of the Guru Granth in the modern Gurdwara, the Sikh temple. In the last 2 decades, there has been something of a renaissance in Sikh musicology, driven by proponents whose primary interest was to reconnect musical praxis to language and literature, the conceptual and the non-conceptual, to bring those two together in their work, and were therefore strongly opposed to importing the religion-secular distinction into their work. Thank you very much. Question here.
I'm not a Punjabi scholar, but there was a student from the University of Michigan who made most secular contribution to my knowledge. When I was growing up in India in 50s and 60s, the most influential writer in the young folks was Gulbaksh Singh. I'm not questioning you on anything, I'm just sharing with you that if you look at the number of books he wrote, the number of articles he wrote, and how students waited for his magazine to come out, the credit goes also to University of Michigan. That's why I'm mentioning it here.
Right, he was a
University of here. His career was like you. He was an engineer, you were a scientist. And then he went to philosophy and politics. That's one part. And the other part is on the same subject, secularism, that when you talk about secularism, I would request that nobody should include Puran Singh in the same boat as with Mohan Singh. Mohan Singh was in Japan, he was in India, I know what he wrote, I read all his books, and it's 100%. But again, my apology, I'm not a scholar. If I say something wrong, please don't.
No, it's a very good point you made, actually. Gurbaksh Singh, I used to tell my students I was sort of raised reading those magazines along with my father. And I think the general trend of Sikhs at that time was influenced strongly by sort of the Marxist movements. There was a movement away from the so-called religious spheres. So you're absolutely right, Gurbaksh Singh has been one of the most important people, but to try and tackle him in this lecture would be rather difficult. That's why it's easier to tackle it through Athar Singh, because he uses the same conceptions. Puran Singh I would disagree on. I think Puran Singh is really struggling with these categories, the religion and the secular, in a way that we're not really beginning to understand just yet. But I take your point. It's a point well made. Thank you. I'm going to take one. Madhav? Sorry. Can I just take the question behind you, then I'll come back to you?
Okay. Can you say something about the emergence of Punjabiyat as well? I mean, is there a version of Punjabiyat in which non-Sikh Punjabis do participate?
Yes, there is. I mean, they participated fairly extensively. I can't name people offhand, but there are plenty of poets and writers who were non-Sikh Punjabis as well. You're absolutely right. Mind is blanking out though, Madhav. Yes, this question.
It was a very good attempt, and we appreciate the university has organized such a wonderful symposium. Giving a respect to Siddharji, in context to your contribution for Sikhism study and philosophy, I would add into your lecture that the contribution made by Professor Nasim Mahbub, who died last year, it will be another appropriate study.
Absolutely. That, I mean, but you know that's an entire. You need a complete different paper, and in fact, complete books on Harinder Singh Mahbub. Mahbub is really, really important. Mahbub died last year. He's credited with actually having thought about and looked at the bifurcation between the religious and the secular on the one hand, and he's probably the only person to have actually wrestled with the Punjabi idiom and changed the Punjabi idiom in a very, very novel way, and you can actually feel that in reading his work. So it's an excellent point. Thank you very much. There's a hand up just behind you. Yeah. Okay.
Say something about Sikhism and secularism, what is going on in the Western universities. You are one, I said, I spoke with another individual, Zealand, and how the same subject is being treated at Punjab University, Punjab, or some other school of Sikh studies.
Repeat the question, please.
Yes, he asked about the treatment of secularism in other universities, Punjab universities as well, both on the in the Western system and also in India as well. It's a very it's a huge topic for me to get into right now. I would simply say that this particular way of looking at it, by taking the religion-secular binary and critiquing the notion of religion, hasn't really caught on in Sikh studies, either in the Punjabi universities or in mainstream Sikh studies. People tend to make the same assumptions that Athar Singh is using, and that's why I use the example of Athar Singh. It's very, very clear, and these are moves that are replicated throughout most of other Sikh studies. I think it'd be really, this needs a much longer discussion than I think we have time for, but maybe we can talk about it later. One question there.
One book on Sikh music was written about 40 years back, I think. It was by Sri Chaitanya, and it was a very impressive book, very thin volume.
So since then, in your knowledge, any good book has come up or any research is being carried out on Sikh music in particular?
There's a whole movement on Sikh music that's just taken root. Interestingly, in the last 20 years, I can think of probably Guru Nanak Singh's work, which has become required reading in the Punjabi universities. It's not used much in the West. But there is a very much a grassroots movement that's questioning the way that music and the literary are sort of kept apart. And a good example is by Baldeep Singh. There's another Professor Surinder Singh in London who's working on this. And incidentally, in the journal that we run here, Sikh Formations, we have an entire issue coming out precisely on this, on music. So if you're interested, just look up Google Sikh Formations for the December issue. Some very, very interesting new research that's just come out precisely on this topic. Yes, Parvinder.
How do you see the future of Sikh studies in terms of Western, universities, UK, US, Canada, and how do you see it in Indian universities? And I ask this because the secularism is different in India and it's different in Western countries. So how do you see the academic discipline? Would it be more defined, more literally in Western universities than in India in terms of history, partition narratives, all the research work that is being done? Do you see a kind of divergence in the discipline itself?
There has been a divergence, but I think certainly in recent years, this particular debate is really mushrooming, and I'm thinking of there's so many conferences going on, and there's a conference cluster called Rethinking Religion in India, which is devoted precisely to this. And that particular cluster has tried to bring people from academics in South Asian studies from the West, from India in particular, to bring them onto a table to really hammer these issues out. It'll take a little bit of time, but this is an intellectual movement that's going to take hold and just keep burning for a number of years. Anything more than that, I'm not sure I can predict where it'll go. It depends on a lot of other factors.
Well, I'm sure there's a lot more questions, and I'd like to invite you to continue the conversation at the reception. I'm going to give Professor Mandair a token of remembrance of the day, and thank him again for what he's doing.
Thank you.